The Hunt for Red October. The Hollywood tale of a rogue Soviet commander who steals a nuclear submarine and heads for the West. But the film is not pure fiction. In 1975, at the height of the Cold War, a Soviet naval officer started a real-life mutiny just as ambitious and equally dangerous. Instead of a submarine called Red October, he stole a state-of-the-art warship called the Sentry.
He was basically going against military Russian machine which could destroy you in a second.
He sailed the ship out of Soviet waters and risked triggering a Third World War. Now, using secret radar footage, we can reveal the extraordinary full story of a mutiny that was covered up for decades.
We see, quite dramatically, much faster moving targets.
And investigate the all-out assault mounted by the Soviet military to halt the renegade ship.
I'm sure there was a split second where, World War III is up.
This is the incredible true story of the mutiny that inspired the hunt for Red October. A winter's evening in 1975. An elite group of warships from the Soviet Union's Baltic Fleet was gathered in the port of Riga. It was the 58th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. And the celebrations were in full swing. But one man had other plans. Political officer Valery Sablin was second in command of the brand new anti-submarine frigate Strochevoy, or the Sentry. 37-year-old Sablin was about to commit an act of almost suicidal daring. He planned to start a mutiny among the crew and take control of the Sentry, one of the Soviet Union's most advanced warships. Sablin seemed an unlikely mutineer. A committed communist and the ship's political officer, it was his job to maintain the crew's revolutionary ideals. One of the men with Sablin on board the Sentry that evening was Viktor Borodai, a 21-year-old midshipman.
He was an interesting man. He was a skilled and good officer. He had 2 degrees. You could go and share things with him. If something happens at home or you need leave, you go to him and explain. The crew loved him.
Sablin was profoundly disillusioned with the Soviet leadership under Premier Leonid Brezhnev.
He was convinced that the Soviet system, the communist system, would triumph regardless. But what he saw everywhere was this incredible corruption within the party. He saw the party elite line their own pockets with oil contracts and diamond mines, and the workers to whom the revolution was supposed to benefit were living largely as they had at the revolution. And I think he looked at Leonid Brezhnev as the figurehead of all of those troubles.
By November 1975, Valery Sablin had had enough. It was time for the ordinary people to rise up against their corrupt leaders. At around 6 p.m., Sablin told Anatoly Potulny, his friend, the ship's captain, that some of the men were drunk on duty. He asked the captain to discipline them and led him down into the bowels of the ship. Then he seized his moment and locked Potulny in an unused storeroom. With the captain imprisoned, the first stage of Sablin's plan was complete. The first Westerner to mount a detailed investigation of the mutiny on the Century was US Navy academic Gregory Young. In 1982, he was writing a PhD on morale in the Soviet Navy when he stumbled across a newspaper article mentioning the incident. After months of secretive phone calls to emigre Russians, he pieced together the incredible story. Young's thesis was filed in the Navy library, but the story wouldn't go away.
I got a letter from this insurance salesman in Owings, Maryland, who said, gee, I'm an insurance salesman, I'm writing my first book. I'd really be interested in using some of these things about the mutiny on the Strozhevoy. Can you tell me a little bit more about it? And we began this correspondence.
The insurance salesman was Tom Clancy, and his book, The Hunt for Red October, became an instant bestseller. It told the seemingly far-fetched story of a rogue Russian officer called Marko Ramius who steals a Soviet submarine and heads for the West. In the real-life mutiny aboard the Century, it was the political officer, not the captain, that stole the ship. With the captain imprisoned, Valery Sablin now had to persuade the ship's officers to join him. He called a meeting in the midshipman's mess.
Товарищи офицеры, я собрал вас здесь для того, чтобы рассказать о своем плане. Курс этого корабля.
It really was the speech of his life.
Мы направляемся к берегам.
He began to talk about the failures of the current communist leadership to adhere to the ideals of the Bolshevik Revolution.
Всему советскому народу, что наша власть совсем забыла о своих.
Sablin outlined his astonishing plan. The Century was due to leave Riga the next morning with the rest of the fleet. But when the convoy turned south for its base at Baltijsk, the Century would continue sailing west. She would cross into international waters before turning east for the final leg of the 500-mile voyage to Leningrad.
В нескольких следующих часов корабль меняет свой курс к берегам.
In Leningrad, Sablin planned to broadcast a radio message calling on the people to overthrow their corrupt masters.
Я хочу, чтобы вы с вами донесли к русскому народу.
His call to arms found support among many of the officers, including young midshipman Viktor Borodai.
Согласны со мной. Я хочу, чтобы
Мы
вы
с ним были
голосовали.
100% согласны.
I agreed with him 100%. We knew everything he was saying was absolutely true. Something had gone wrong in the country. It wasn't as good as newspapers described.
Газетах, да?
Товарищ Саблин, я согласен. Товарищ.
But some of the officers, including Lieutenant Boris Gindin, thought that stealing the Century was a suicidal plan.
He didn't realize probably what he is going against. And he was basically going against military Russian machine which could destroy you in a second.
Я собрал вас здесь для того, чтобы
Even to talk about mutiny or be involved in a mutiny should be punished by death.
Sablin ordered the officers to vote using checkers pieces, white for the mutiny, black against.
It's interesting at this point to think about this. This is a frontline Soviet warship. You've got 16 career Soviet naval officers in a room. They're going to take a vote whether to mutiny or not. The 16 officers present split down the middle.
Похоже, что
8
мнения разделились.
in favor and 8 opposed.
The vote was split, but for Sablin and the mutineers, there was no turning back. Those who voted against the mutiny, including Boris Gindin, were led away.
basically one by one. It was very narrow entrance, was going down to that compartment, and the compartment was locked.
The mutiny on the Sentry had begun. A 37-year-old officer was poised to confront the combined might of the Soviet military. In November 1975, a mutiny was underway on the Soviet frigate, the Sentry. The captain had been imprisoned by rogue officer Valery Sablin, who'd taken command of the ship.
Товарищи моряки, я собрал вас здесь, на этой
But now he had to persuade the ship's 150 conscript sailors to join him. On deck, Sablin unveiled his audacious plan to spearhead the overthrow of the corrupt Soviet regime and launch a second People's Revolution. Highly popular among the men, Sablin had already entrusted details of his plan to one of them, 20-year-old conscript Alexander Shane.
I never met a more decent man in my life.
Sablin convinced the sailors that they would be the heroes of a new revolution.
When the General Assembly for Seamen finished, they felt uplifted, saying that we'll be the first to act.
Sablin had enough officers and men on side to carry out his plan. But a crisis was brewing. The ship was still at anchor, and one of the officers, Lieutenant Firsov, only voted for the mutiny so he could choose his moment to escape. Firsov slipped away undetected, determined to raise the alarm. The crew soon discovered his escape. It was a disaster. Sablin had planned to leave Riga with the rest of the fleet at dawn, slipping away from the convoy once they reached open water. But now, officers from the feared secret police, the KGB, could appear at any moment. Sablin had to rethink his strategy. There was only one possible course of action. The 3,000-ton sentry would have to sneak out of Riga docks under cover of night. There was no turning back now. Like Captain Marko Ramius in the hunt for Red October, Sablin was stealing a state-of-the-art vessel patrolling the front line of Soviet defense. Unlike the submarine Red October in the film, the Sentry didn't carry nuclear weapons. But she was just 18 months old and carried the latest top-secret military hardware. A Krivak-class frigate with a top speed of 32 knots, she bristled with torpedoes, missiles, and two 76mm guns. Specifically designed to combat American Polaris submarines, the Krivak class fascinated Western defense experts who knew virtually nothing of its capabilities. By 1975, Premier Leonid Brezhnev had spent vast amounts re-equipping the Soviet Navy, and ships like the Sentry were the jewels in the superpower's military crown.
It was said of Brezhnev that if the Americans had it, then the Soviet Union ought to have it too. The fundamental factor in American strategic power was a superpower navy, so the Soviet Union had to have one too.
Sablin may have had no intention of handing over Soviet secrets to the West, but he had staged a mutiny, a crime punishable by death. His only hope of reaching Leningrad unscathed was to put as much distance as possible between the Sentry and her inevitable pursuers. By 1 a.m., the ship was sailing at full speed down the narrow channel of the Daugava River. The crew had to sail without lights to avoid being seen. Worse, they couldn't even use their radar to navigate, as the signal would give away their position. Sailing blind, they faced the ever-present risk of hitting rocks or going aground. But somehow, the Sentry pulled through.
We managed to navigate the river ourselves. We didn't run aground or hit a rock. Probably we were lucky.
Fate had dealt Sablin another stroke of luck. Back in Riga, Lieutenant Firsov, the officer who escaped, was having trouble raising the alarm. The dockside guard didn't believe his far-fetched story of a shipboard mutiny. The Sentry now had a valuable head start. After 3 hours of difficult and dangerous navigation, Sablin and his crew reached the Gulf of Riga. But it would be another 20 hours before they could complete their voyage to Leningrad and broadcast their message to the people. Deep below decks, the captain was powerless in his windowless prison, guarded by Seaman Shane. The officers, locked in a different cabin, were terrified what might happen when the Soviet top brass discovered Sablin's treachery.
We were locked in that compartment. We were very scared because we know for sure that the Russian government would never let us go somewhere or do something besides what we have to do as a military ship.
5 hours after the Sentry set sail, Firsov's account of the mutiny finally reached the Soviet Navy's top brass. Vice Admiral Kosov, Chief of Staff of the Baltic Fleet put a call through to Sablin on the sentry's radio. He ordered the ship to stop and drop anchor. But Sablin had stopped listening to his superiors.
I heard that there was a proposition. All will be forgiven. Just stop and we'll discuss everything. Sablin refused.
Плывем, ребята, плывем. У меня пока тишина.
At the Kremlin, Marshal Grechko, the Minister of Defense, was given the news. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Grechko faced the unenviable task of waking up the Soviet Premier, Leonid Brezhnev. He told Brezhnev that a 37-year-old political officer had staged a mutiny and was heading out to sea with a state-of-the-art warship. For the Soviet leadership, there was one inescapable conclusion. Sablin must be defecting to the west. On its present course, the ship could reach Swedish waters just 140 miles away within 5 hours. That was an unthinkable prospect for the secretive Soviet regime.
There were at least two problems for the Soviets involved in the escape of this ship. First of all, it's a terrible slap in the eye for Soviet prestige.
Да, срочно.
And secondly, the fact that this Krivak-type frigate, which clearly the West doesn't fully understand, might well be seen by Western intelligence agents.
The Navy sprang into action, mobilizing ships from the Baltic ports of Riga and Lipaye. Alexander Bobrikov was a missile boat commander. Stationed at the naval base at Lipaye in Latvia, his orders were clear: hunt down the sentry and stop it from reaching Sweden.
I was ordered to put to sea with 2 small missile ships. And if it doesn't stop before the 20th parallel, then destroy the ship with a missile strike.
Soviet patriot Bobrikov would not hesitate to sink the sentry with 180 Navy comrades on board if it kept the ship out of enemy hands.
All the codes would have been disclosed for the missile warheads. No spy could ever obtain such information. A military ship like this was stuffed with secrets.
The Navy also sent up 2 of its Ilyushin 38 reconnaissance planes to help with the search. But finding the sentry wasn't going to be easy. Sablin had turned the radar transmitter off to avoid detection, and spotting her by eye amid thousands of square miles of Baltic Sea was almost impossible. By 6 a.m., the sentry was just 2 hours away from leaving Soviet territory and entering international waters. If the Soviets failed to stop the sentry before that point, then the incident could have been caught in the spotlight of the world's media. Being seen to sink one of its own ships was almost unthinkable for the Soviet regime. It looked as though Sablin might just make it. But then, a setback. The ship encountered thick fog.
Пока все чисто. Но ты нас смотри. Оба смотри.
It was a terrible dilemma. Sablin knew that he was about to enter a busy shipping lane. Without radar, he risked a fatal collision with another ship. But if he switched on the sentry's radar, it would emit a signal revealing her position on Soviet radar screens all over the Baltic. Sablin decided the risk of collision was the greater threat.
Оба только смотри.
Within minutes, the ship's signal was picked up by the Navy reconnaissance planes. The Soviet High Command finally had a fix on the renegade ship. In Skiratava near Riga, a waiting squadron of Tu-16 fighter bombers was armed and given the order for takeoff. Their mission: to sink the Sentry. In the Cold War movie The Hunt for Red October, Soviet forces pursue a rogue submarine commander trying to defect to the west. In the real-life mutiny that inspired the film, renegade officer Valery Sablin claimed a very different aim. He had taken over Soviet warship the Sentry to spearhead a people's revolution against the ruling Soviet regime. To reach Leningrad, where Sablin planned to broadcast a message to the people, he would first have to sail west into international waters. 6 hours into the voyage, that meant the ship appeared to be heading straight for Sweden. On the island of Gotland, the Swedish military's early warning system picked up a Russian warship on its radar, 3 hours away from Swedish waters. And a flurry of military aircraft activity. Yet the Swedes had received no warning of naval maneuvers from the Soviets.
To see all this sudden activity must have been deeply disturbing to the Swedish surveillance systems. After all, the warning time for Sweden was not very great.
In November 1975, the Cold War was at its height. The world faced the constant threat of nuclear annihilation as the Soviet bloc and the Western Alliance faced each other with tens of thousands of nuclear warheads apiece.
Well, in this knife-edge situation, there was a possibility that somebody, by intention, or perhaps unintentionally, might do something that might seem to the other side to be an attack. And the world might end because people didn't know what was going on.
One false move in this global game of brinksmanship and neutral Sweden could be caught in the crossfire. The Swedish radar operators made a recording of what they saw that day on their screens. True Stories has gained access to this extraordinary material, which is being seen outside Sweden for the first time.
Well, here we have, it's approaching 6 o'clock, a quiet winter's morning in the Baltic. Nobody's expecting anything to happen. It's been Revolution Day in Russia the previous day. First sign, perhaps, that all is not well is this contact here, flying a search pattern up and down, probably an IL-38 reconnaissance aircraft, which we know was sent out to try to find the errant Soviet ship. And then a lot of aircraft suddenly appear. It's a large number of aircraft, and they fly around in their attack patterns looking for something, quite clearly looking for something.
The radar had picked up the squadron of Tu-16 bombers sent out to sink the Sentry. Armed with long-range missiles, they were a mainstay of Soviet air defense throughout the Cold War.
The centre of attention does seem to be in this sort of triangle here. What the Swedes here thought was happening, heaven knows.
The radar operators reported the unusual activity to their superiors.
At first, the Swedes, they must have been horrified. I mean, here's the entire Soviet Navy, and a huge part of the Soviet Naval Air Force was coming out to a small part of the Baltic Sea. I'm sure there was a split second where, World War III is up.
8 hours after the Sentry left Riga, the pursuing aircraft had come within firing range of the ship. The Tu-16s were equipped with first-generation Soviet cruise missiles, designed to destroy lone aircraft carriers in the open ocean. And that was problematic. The missile's primitive onboard aiming device could only be guaranteed to hit the Sentry if she was the only ship in the area. In fact, she was just about to enter a busy shipping lane.
When a missile is launched, its aiming device opens up, and it starts to look for a target within an area of about 10 kilometers. Maybe there could be 10 ships within that area. How do you choose the right target?
Such a drastic mistake might even have risked igniting a nuclear war.
If there had been, say, a major warship of Sweden or a Western power hit or destroyed, if a merchant ship or a ferry had been hit, there would have been a really major crisis.
The Sentry was now only half an hour away from leaving Soviet waters. International waters offered Sablin and his crew a chance of safety. Here, the Soviets might be witnessed attacking one of their own warships, a serious humiliation for the ruling regime. But the Soviet regime wasn't about to let the Sentry escape. After the failure of the Navy Tu-16s to stop the ship, they mobilized the Air Force.
We see, quite dramatically, coming out of here, the Air Force base here, very much faster moving targets. These are much faster aircraft. These are the Yak-28s. And they all seem to be concentrating on this particular point here.
A squadron of 18 Yak-28s raced towards the Sentry. They were each armed with 4 550-pound bombs, ideal for close-range attack. And their top speed of 750 miles per hour meant they could reach the ship within 15 minutes. The regiment's Deputy Chief of Staff, Alexander Simbalov, is speaking about his role publicly for the first time.
When we found out the ship was being hijacked, there was only one thing we suspected. They were taking the ship to Sweden. Our mission was to stop the ship.
The Sentry was heading west at full speed. Admiral Gorshkov radioed Sablin to tell him that planes and boats were closing in for the attack. He ordered him to stop or the ship would be destroyed. But Sablin, minutes from reaching international waters, refused. Instead, he broadcast a tape over military channels declaring that he was not a defector but a revolutionary patriot. Recruiting his pursuers to the cause might dissuade them from attacking the ship. But Sablin's plea did not deflect the Yak bombers. Their orders were clear: stop the traitor.
The pilots didn't question this. The ship was Soviet, but it was being hijacked by criminal individuals.
12 miles west of the 22nd meridian, the Sentry crossed into international waters. She was no longer under the territorial jurisdiction of the Soviet Union. It seemed that Sablin had made it. But if the renegade commander thought they were out of danger, he was wrong.
I think the Soviet authorities were looking at the least worst option here, and the least worst option was sinking it. You could always say it was an exercise. Much worse for the thing to go to Sweden, and for the West to get a really close look at one of the Soviet Navy's latest ships, only a year or two old.
The Sentry was now only 2 hours from Swedish waters. For the Swedish military, it was crisis point. Could they really be witnessing the first stage of a Soviet attack?
So here was a kind of knife edge, you know, do we mobilize the armed forces? Because if you start mobilizing, then it looks to the other side as if you're going to war. So it was a very difficult situation.
The Swedes decided not to launch a military response. But incredibly, they took no action to raise the alarm with other Western governments. Meanwhile, Captain Bobrikov's patrol boat now had the ship within range of its twin SSN-2 missiles. He radios Sablin an ultimatum.
I said, please stop the ship. I've been given orders to destroy you.
But before he could fire, Yak bombers appeared on the horizon and flew low over the ship.
I was really frightened when I saw planes coming overhead in groups of 3 with their bombs ready to be dropped.
With an attack imminent, Sablin scrambled the crew to battle stations. Now the officers imprisoned below decks heard the sound they'd been dreading, the whine of fighter bombers. If the ship was bombed, it could sink in minutes, and they had no chance of escape.
When we realized this ship is under attack, we knew that it would lead to us probably to be dead in that compartment.
In the forward hold, Captain Putulny was desperate to escape from his prison. The first Yak now had the Sentry in its sights.
Firstly, they shot at the port side with machine guns. There were holes all down the port side of the ship.
The ship was armed with automatic anti-aircraft cannon. But Sablin pulled back from the brink. He ordered the crew not to fire on fellow Russians. But the pilots had no such qualms.
The first bomb hit the ship. The rest fell along the left side of the vessel. I couldn't see the ship behind the column of water. When it disappeared, I understood that bombs must have been dropped.
A bomb had struck the sentry in the stern, and she was taking on water. Below decks, there was pandemonium. A second wave of aircraft were just minutes away, ready to deliver the killer blow. The crew realized the game was up. If they didn't surrender immediately, then everyone on board could die.
People did get scared, as no one wanted to die, especially with 150 young lads in the crew. What's the point in drowning so many people?
Finally, one group of sailors could take no more. They rushed to free the imprisoned officers before the yaks could strike again.
Door was open and sailor was yelling us, "Get out from there, help us out, because something bad is happening."
The freed officers raced to the bows of the ship to release the captain.
Товарищ капитан! Товарищ капитан, вы здесь?
Атаку не отвечать! Противовоздушная оборона!
Sablin was still on the bridge broadcasting to the ship when Captain Anatoly Potolny arrived.
Прекратить стрельбу! Стрельбу! По них не стрелять! Ах ты сволочь! Что сволочь? Что, освободили? Sablin went down. Potulny tried to get on the radio to announce to everyone that the mutiny was now over.
Капитан Потульный здесь! Всем отбой!
Captain Potolny told the top brass to hold their fire.
Капитан Потульный на своем мостике!
We understood everything at once. The regiment commander took the decision in an instant and ordered all crews to stop the combat mission.
Отходите!
The captain had saved his crew in the nick of time.
А ну вон отсюда с мостика!
The pursuing vessels surrounded the sentry, and a squad of Marines boarded the ship. They rounded up the mutineers.
They put us together upstairs, officers and midshipmen up against the wall. Then after that, I was standing like a dummy against the wall.
Руки за голову, быстро! Устроились. Правда, что вы все предатели?
Interrogations began almost immediately.
Стреляют вас за это.
The mutineers faced the death penalty.
Immediately they separated everyone, trying to establish who was most active and who held most. It was scary, especially when you're 20 and haven't seen much in life.
The mutiny was over. The Sentry was finally stopped in international waters, still 400 miles from Leningrad, but only 53 miles from Swedish territory. The unprecedented attack was followed from the outset by the Swedish military. For hours they had watched a Soviet firefight in the neutral waters of the Baltic, but never raised the alarm with the wider world. In the murky world of Cold War politics, the Swedes had good reason to keep the whole incident under wraps. When Soviet airplanes bombed the renegade warship the Sentry, the Swedish military had seen the whole thing on their radar screens. But they were also listening in to a blow-by-blow commentary on the incident. The Soviet pilots had taken off in such a hurry that many of them had forgotten to turn on their radio scramblers.
They were talking to each other in the clear, uncoded. So the Swedes, by virtue of geography, they were listening. But it's interesting, the Swedes were initially unwilling to confirm this.
The reason for their silence lies in the cloak and dagger world of Cold War arms deals.
Their listening equipment was purchased from the United States out of a secret slush fund, primarily to monitor Soviet military communications. So to admit that they had monitored this activity wasn't so much that they cared about that, but they would then be forced to admit the purchase of this equipment.
Had the Swedes gone public with what they knew about the Sentry incident, it would reveal that they owned state-of-the-art electronic eavesdropping equipment which could only have been bought from the United States.
It was a vitally important part of their whole policy of neutrality that they kept as quiet as possible. And also, you don't want to publicize it too much because you don't want to poke your finger in the eye of this very powerful superpower neighbor. So let's just keep quiet about it.
But while the Swedes just kept quiet, the Brezhnev regime launched a massive cover-up.
They hauled a target barge out in the vicinity the next couple of days and said, gee, we were sorry we didn't announce we were having an target exercise out here, and sorry we didn't let you know.
On the home front, imprisoning the 180 mutineers would risk magnifying the events in the public eye, causing the story to spread throughout the Soviet Union. At a time of great economic hardship, it could have become a powerful focus for public unrest. Instead, all the ship's officers, including those who voted against the mutiny, were demoted or dishonorably discharged. Even Lieutenant Firsov, the man who bravely escaped to raise the alarm. Most of the conscripts were just sent home. Everyone was forced to sign a pledge of secrecy.
That was the deal. You go free and keep your mouth shut. It was a state secret, and any disclosure would mean a prison sentence.
Sablin's young accomplice, the 20-year-old conscript Alexander Shane, whose job had been to guard the captain, was sent to prison for 8 years and forbidden from revealing his offense. He even had to tell his family that he was in jail on a secret mission.
Well, the state had to cover up what happened in reality. My parents knew nothing about it when they used to come and visit me.
But for the leader of the mutiny, leniency was out of the question. Valery Sablin was accused of attempting to defect to the West, tried for treason, and found guilty.
In May of '76, 6 months after the mutiny, Sablin was sentenced to death by the highest court of military appeals. All the lower levels of the court had been skipped. And we think he got a 9mm bullet from a Makarov in the back of the head.
Boris Gindin, who has since emigrated to America and written a book about the mutiny, thinks Sablin risked all their lives for a dream that he could never pull off.
Personally, I would call him, Valery Sablin, like a really naive person who decided that this right time to do this mutiny without even thinking about what kind of consequences would be.
Yet Viktor Borodai believes that in 1975 the Russian people were ready for change.
It couldn't carry on forever. The stupidity going on in our country at that time. Something had to be changed. It just wasn't right.
1989, 14 years after the mutiny, the Soviet Union was entering its final death throes, a demise dramatically symbolized by the destruction of the Berlin Wall.
We now know in retrospect that the Soviet Union was cracking up. So if you like, the mutiny was the first little bit of canker in the middle of the Soviet fruit that would eventually lead to its shocking collapse. But of course, nobody expected this to happen at the time. The Soviet image of strength was just so great.
Ironically, the hero of the film The Hunt for Red October, Marco Ramius, was a defector, intent on leaving his homeland for a new life in the West. But for Gregory Young, the real-life mutiny on the century is the more inspiring tale.
The true story of a political officer, a true zealot, an idealist, maybe naive, not leaving his motherland, but determined to change the motherland, bring it back to the true ideals of communism, and willing to risk his life for those ideals is a better story.